Should we do it without the lights? No.
Thanks for such a big turnout, especially this many people. It's great. Firstly, thank Owen for coming over to talk this evening. Also to CRH for sponsoring the talk, for bringing him here. For anyone who doesn't know, Owen is a journalist and writer who writes mainly about architecture and politics for Building Design, New Kings and Guardian newspaper. He also maintains 3 blogs on the net as well. So just to deal with the title of tonight, which is Form Follows Function, Follows Ideology, the magnificent play of volumes underlined under capitalism. Mark is going to briefly introduce some of the thoughts on it.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I just, in this, the title that we proposed, Form Follows Function, Follows Ideology, or the magnificent play of volumes under capitalism, we're trying to convey something of the elusive quality of ideology. There's an old joke, you might know, behind every great man is a woman, behind that woman is his wife. That's the, that's a very old joke. That's the sense in which ideology is everywhere, and yet nowhere, and that we know it and we don't know it. In fact, we don't know usually that we know it. Slavoj Žižek wrote once about Rumsfeld. He said the great American philosopher Donald Rumsfeld. We all remember his known knowns and unknowns. Do you remember that? When Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, he said that terrorism comes in 3 forms. The first type is the known knowns, the things that we know that we know. The second types are the known unknowns, the things that we know that we don't know. But the worrying third category for Rumsfeld was the unknown unknowns. This was the thing that kept him awake at night, the things that we don't know that we don't know. Žižek says, despite his brilliance and insights, he had missed and overlooked the 4th crucial category, which are the unknown knowns, the things that we don't know that we know. This is what ideology is. Ideology is something that we don't know because it appears so obvious, because it's all around us. So it's not a theory, it's a basis of a theory. And we don't know it because it appears natural. It always appears self-evident. A good way to illustrate this would be if you say to an architect who practices sustainable design, I like your style, I like your sustainable style. It reminds me of the arts and crafts movement, or even the English landscape movement, as a reaction to the predations of capital. It's very sophisticated. The architects would be likely to say to you, oh, you've actually got that wrong. This isn't a style, this is real. We are really saving the planet by reducing the carbon load. Whereas what they were doing in those days was just a sort of decorative scheme which a privileged minority of people applied in order to allow themselves to continue to enjoy the benefits of enclosures and privatisation and industrialisation, while maintaining a symbolic distance at the same time, and not actually doing anything about it. And so you go, oh yeah, okay, I see the difference. Yeah, thanks for clearing that one up. Because, in fact, ideology presents itself always as the real, the reality. And it isn't. It's actually a representation. But it's not completely a representation. Marx is the great theorist, the original theorist of ideology, compares it to a camera obscura, you know, where the image is projected but upside down. So reality is ideology is a representation of reality, but through a lens or through a prism of interest. It's reality represented with a specific interest. I wanted to speak here tonight, a colleague, friend Marnie Holborough, who lectures in DCU on ideology and linguistics. She just published, co-authored a book called Neoliberalism and Applied Linguistics. And in this, she focuses on ideology. She describes ideology as a representational mechanism articulated on behalf of specific social interests, which precisely blurs the distinction between itself and reality. So, ideology misrepresents reality, but the misrepresentation is only partial. It's provisional. It's not always easy to see how it occurs, and it relies on reality. So, I'm just going to finish with an example which relates to a film which we saw at the film festival recently about the art schools in Cuba. I don't know if anyone saw the film Unfinished Spaces. I'm going to try and get it here. Okay, that isn't what I wanted first. I want to Google. So, the film is called Unfinished Spaces, and unfinished housing estates is what you get when you look up this in Ireland. And that's good. And he showed these wonderful buildings which had been made at the time of the revolution, promoted by Castro and Che Guevara. And they were these wonderful curvilinear art buildings, and they started with great fanfare, but they gradually, the support for these projects gradually stopped. And the film tells the story of how these projects ground to a halt. And the story is presented that these art schools were in opposition to ideas that were sent from Moscow to Cuba. Ideas which all had to do with prefabricated housing. So we alternated shots of this wonderful guy, Ricardo Porro, who was the leading architect, who talked about how he liked his buildings to represent the female, her anatomy in a very figurative way. And he talked in this sensuous way about architecture. And this was contrasted with the great villain, which was shots of concrete slabs being hoisted into space, into place for blocks of flats. And this was meant to be the malign influence of Moscow on these projects, the reason given in the film why they ended. However, if you look up Ricardo Porro, I hope I can do this now. Here we go. Search Ricardo Porro. Sorry. If you look him up on the internet, you see how I'm good at this kind of thing. And you get the Wikipedia entry. And this is a classic moment of ideology, I think, but I suggest it anyway, maybe you'll think differently. They give the story of him, and then down here, can you see my thing? It says that he began doing Fidel Castro as head of the National Art Schools, and then he was joined by the architects, and then in 1968, he went in exile to France, following political realignment in Cuba, a shift which deemed the architecture and architects of Cuba's National Art Schools to be a politically incorrect counter to the Soviet functionalism. So we see Soviet functionalism as the villain, the great killjoy of the piece. And I thought, this is great, I'm going to find out about Soviet functionalism. But you go and you click on it, and you discover, in fact, it isn't a link at all. The first one is the Soviet Union, etc., etc. And you find out all about that. And then you go and think, well, fine, I'll go and look at functionalists then. And what do we get? We're back at our title, Louis Sullivan, Form Follows Function. I'll have to get the history of functionalism here. Absolutely no mention of the Soviet Union. It's Louis Sullivan, it's Frank Lloyd Wright, it's Buckminster Fuller. And in other words, functionalism has nothing to do with the Soviet Union. And if you look up this, and it's going to the very end of this, and look for anything to do with Russia, you get constructivism, which is surely functionalist, but hardly Soviet, nothing to do with collectivism in any way, as far as I know, and fell foul of the Soviets quite early on. And then later on you get Stalinism, here somewhere. And obviously Stalinism could be described as Soviet, obviously, but hardly functionalist. I mean, over the top, camp maybe. So what we see here in this Soviet functionalism, just at this moment, we see ideology at work. Almost everyone I say this to goes, but do you want to live in a horrible block of flats in Russia? And that is an example of how ideology works. It's a misrepresentation, a partial misrepresentation, in order to further an ideological purpose, which is pretty obvious in this case. So that's the title of that's the reason for our title tonight, and so I'm going to hand over to Owen.
What I'll be talking about is, I guess, connected to the preamble, although in an often loose sense. What this is going to draw on is projects I've been working on and off in various forms since about the last 3 years, which sort of started off as a sort of recession travelogue for an architecture trade paper called Building Design, and sort of grew into a sort of book and then a subsequent book which we published in a few months, which basically consists of a load of kind of wanderings around British cities and kind of sort of applying two things to them which are sort of generally considered to be secondary, or people act as if they're secondary, and taking them instead as being completely fundamental drivers to how they developed and redeveloped. One of which is capitalism, obviously, and the other of which is architectural theory or architectural fashion, and the kind of various changes of it, and the various quite strictly sort of ideological ways that something that at one point is common sense ceased to be common sense, and then another common sense becomes common sense, and everyone forgets that previously the other common sense was completely opposition to one another. There's kind of architecture is particularly acute for this. The kind of sudden shifts of fashion always kind of fought out with great bigotry, which usually sort of resolve themselves into the same people holding completely opposing positions to what they 20 years before. And I think that these two things, particularly sort of modernism and the reaction to modernism, had a very significant effect. And also, the reason for talking about the UK or the relevance of it, other than the fact that it's what I spent most of the last few years doing, is that to sort of make a phrase from Patrick Keeler, which I think he got from Alan Weakson's Wood, that the UK, and unfortunately, and shoot me down in flames for this, but unfortunately Ireland also have tended to adhere to what Keeler at first sort of describes as a peculiarly capitalist way of building cities, and then kind of gradually realises is actually a kind of a way of building cities which isn't a kind of peculiar kind of capitalism, eccentric capitalism, you know, kind of suburban, retrograde capitalism doesn't fit with the capitalism of Western Europe, but in fact, a more fundamental capitalism. One, you know, what happens when you design, you know, cities and an entire country on the most relentlessly capitalist terms, from the earliest point, really, from and the places where you have most comprehensively obliterated any of the things that precede capitalism. In a book called Pristine Culture of Capitalism, Mixon's Wood talks about how you know, the sort of things that kind of American and British tourists like when they go to Bruges or when they go to Barcelona or whatever, are remnants of pre-capitalist urban cultures, remnants of guilds, remnants of craftsman traditions, remnants of kind of this sort of feudal monitoring of building and of architecture. And curiously enough, this is something that actually survives in Scotland, and not in England and Wales or Ireland. Scotland has this kind of, you know, has this feudal control over architecture right into the 20th century, which is one reason why their cities feel much more urban and feel much more European than cities in the rest of Britain and Ireland. So there is a sense that they are overdetermined to a massive extent by capitalism, British cities and British architecture, and also a sense in which, as particularly extreme capitalist societies, which very, very early on obliterated the craft tradition, obliterated guilds, obliterated the kind of, you know, the sort of imposed feudal order that lay behind lots of planning in Western Europe. And by obliterating all of these things, they actually had a much more extreme class system. And in analysing any part of architecture in the UK, really, and I very much suspect the same applies here, or they tell me, please tell me if not afterwards, that class is just a completely dominant way of assessing things. You can point to someone at the exact same concrete tower block, essentially, and it will be described as an eyesore or as a kind of luxurious, iconic building, depending on who's living. The Barbican is, you know, is fantastic and iconic because it's inhabited by stockbrokers who pay millions of pounds for flats. Very, very similar buildings in Poplar and East London are disgusting eyesores because they're lived in by Bengali working class families. You know, you are really dealing with some things that are so similar, but the interpretations are so different. And I think that that's fundamentally about class. But what I think, I mean, sort of running through this is also a kind of argument about the kind of there's several attempts to change this. That I think a large proportion of the British architects and British intelligentsia were quite aware of this and felt quite guilty. You know, they would sort of go to Berlin or Stockholm or Barcelona and feel vaguely ashamed of London and of Manchester and Cardiff and so on and so forth, and would attempt to sort of bring ideas that they had found in Western Europe, in which to kind of add to the kind of the plan traditions of absolutism, there was the new planning ideas of social democracy. So there was this kind of sense that there were these two kind of not really capitalist forms happening in Western Europe, and both of them are kind of attempted in the 20th century in the UK. And both of them have been attempted in the similarly suburban, similarly dispersed cities of Ireland. And although I think of a fair amount less ideological baggage, I may be wrong. Obviously the example of this that's most famous in the UK is from the 40s right, until the 70s, where it's sort of attempted part of the kind of European mainstream of modernism, and very quickly decides that it doesn't like it one bit. A more recent, and the one that was much, much less kind of written about, instead of one which I've kind of obsessively tried to write about over the last few years, was the attempt since 1997 to return to some form of urbanism and some form of modern architecture and some form of Europeanism. One which has sort of essentially ended in this. And I'll explain why it ended in this a bit later, but this is, I think, a kind of nice image to explain why. This is a place called Middlehaven in Middlesbrough, a steel town on the North Sea, which got in the architect Will Alsop to design a kind of the sort of Super Mario land that you see up here. A sort of bouncy, fun place in order to revitalise a place that was one of the poorest in the UK, simply because no one had jobs making steel or the docks anymore. And no one was really likely to see when this was built either. But nonetheless, this was the sort of idea. We build these kind of iconic riverside type places. People would flock to them, and it didn't really happen. It happened in the bigger cities, but the many other places that tried it, the result was this. Enormous wasteland with a big sign saying, "This is coming soon," and the date gets further and further and further away. When I was writing these things, the book that I had kind of often with me was a travel book written in the early 30s by the Yorkshireman J.B. Priestley, called English Journey, where he sort of goes up and down the country from Southampton up to Newcastle. And at the end of it, at the end of this kind of travel log written during the Great Depression, he says that he's really seen three discrete countries which don't really add up, which don't really correspond to each other, which are quite hostile. The first of them he describes as England 1. And England 1 is Oxford and Cambridge, the Cotswolds, you know, the stately houses, old landed power. A country which he describes as long since ceased to earn its own living, by which he essentially means it makes its living from renting capitalism. It doesn't produce anything, but it makes an enormous amount of money off land speculation and also off the City of London, off the kind of financial speculation going on in the City of London. So, kind of topical. The second place he sees, sorry, I should say that that's a picture of it, so the England 1 being represented by, I think it's All Souls in Oxford, I'm not sure. I walked somewhere there. This is Preston in the middle. Preston was Charles Dickens's Coke town, so it's quite an apt place to stand in for the England 2 of the Industrial Revolution. England 2 localised in mainly in the north of England, but also in the West Midlands, East Midlands towns like Leicester and Nottingham, even southern towns like Portsmouth, Southampton, Chatham, etc., etc. A very, very dense industrial form of urbanism, which is brought into being by a kind of bourgeoisie. The people who bring this into being, the kind of the cotton manufacturers, the people who own the steel mills, the shipbuilders, the dock companies, the people that own these things, for instance, in Germany and France, when they industrialised in the later 19th century, they would usually live in the city. They would have their own districts in the city itself, in which they would frequently live in blocks of flats, in Vienna or Berlin or Paris. In Britain, or rather in England and Wales and Ireland, not in Scotland again, the people who earned the money in this way didn't live in middle-class inner-city districts and blocks of flats. They were as keen as possible to simulate being from England one. They were kind of obsessively keen on the idea of being kind of country barons, so sort of pretending to be landed capitalists. And as soon as they possibly could, these people would often, sort of put their money into speculation, put their money into the city, or put their money into land, rather than putting their money into manufacturing, which were kind of grubby and vulgar. So you have this strange situation where the country which becomes urban before any other, that by the middle of the 19th century, for the first time, it's the country which has more people living in cities than in the countryside. The first in world history. Is also, the first industrial power in world history. Has a massive problem with urbanism and industry. The reactions that you get to it are kind of horrified by urbanism and industry, and rather than trying to humanise those two things, you try to kind of get away from them altogether, while at the same time making their money from it. So there's this strange kind of bad faith comes in, which Mark alluded to earlier on with the arts and crafts movement. England 3, which Priestley sees being built round him in the early 30s, is a country of suburbia, a country of sort of looping suburban development, semi-detached houses, council houses, meaning at this point kind of peripheral council estates of little cottages like Becontree in East London rather than what they would mean later. Also meant things like Brighton, this is Embassy Court in Brighton. Kind of a sort of architecture of leisure and a kind of consumer suburbia, which he constantly says feels more like California than like England. He constantly refers to California as the model for this England being built in the 30s. Something that I think was very prophetic of him. After 1945, this kind of gets replaced by an England that Priestley himself kind of helps to bring into being, as he was quite committed sort of socialist propagandist. And the England 4, I think, can only be understood dialectically, that you can only see it as a play of forces. After 1945, you get for the first time really, you get a compromise in the class war, as it were. For the first time, you get a sense in which capital and labour actually have to compromise. That you get the building of a welfare state, of mass council housing, of national health service, etc., of full employment, and so on and so forth. That these concessions essentially were sort of given as a guarantee against revolution. So you sort of have a pact, really for the first time, between the rulers and the ruled, across Europe, really, east and west, and to a degree in the USA as well. And given that that was a compromise, it was compromised. So you got a sense in which, in some cases, I think genuine attempts were made to build a more democratic and more humane society in the UK, more than there had been at any previous point in its history. And at the same time, the same mechanisms of accumulation and capitalism and of corporatism especially continued. So the two images I've got here really are Birmingham. Birmingham is a place where you really get the best and the worst of post-war architecture. I could have shown somewhere like Sheffield where you get pretty much only the best, or somewhere like Glasgow where you get only the worst, but Birmingham is good for being very much in between. This is an estate called Chamberlain Gardens, which, whatever anyone else might say, I think it's great. It's very much an example of this kind of compromise because it took over the gardens of villas. That there were suburban villas here, right in the middle of Birmingham, because Birmingham's a very suburban city. That these suburban villas right in the middle of Birmingham were compulsorily purchased by the Labour government. Cleared, knocked down, and the trees and the kind of undulating landscape of them retained in a new development. So you've got these very, very kind of well-made, well-ordered blocks of flats kind of placed into this rolling parkland. You know, people who moved in before that had no experience of running hot water, no experience of inside toilets. You know, were given these, you know, ultra-modern places, which at that point the middle classes would probably have killed it. So there, I think you've had a genuine advance. And you also had things like this. This is New Street Station, possibly the worst railway station in Europe. I can't think of any competition. Certainly the worst railway station of any major city in Europe. And just a shocking bit of speculation, really, that the actual station part of New Street is almost non-existent. You've got this kind of, you've got this windowless thing with terrible, like, low ceilings. And the rest of it is just a gigantic shopping mall over the tracks. The whole thing completely centred towards the car, completely centred towards consumerism and so forth. These things, I think, which were really things that later go on to make the subsequent 5. These are both around the corner from each other, and they mark the poles, I think, of an England 5, if I'm going to follow Priestley's slightly shaky terminology. These are both embarking at the point where East London starts to meet Essex, so a kind of typical kind of suburban endpoint. This is the shopping centre embarking, which really encapsulates the 80s architecture for me in the UK. That you create a new landscape. First of all, what you do is you create a new landscape made up of motorways, made up of car access, made up of downtown shopping centres. You create a landscape which essentially could not possibly have existed until it was created by 1920 Southern California, basically. And you try not to make it look scary or new. You kind of detail it in a sort of fiberglass Georgian and give it this Victorian clock, and you kind of desperately try not to make it look as modern and unnerving as it actually is. And this, I think, is an example of the spectacularly suburban methods of development that were favoured in the 1980s in the UK under Margaret Thatcher. That her planning officer, head of planning, not planning officer, that her minister for such things, Nicholas Ridley, essentially got rid of the planning system. Essentially, allowed developers to build things more or less where they liked, what they liked. So you've got this kind of, and the sad thing was this the proliferation of suburbia without, and the kind of inner cities being left to rot, and the centres of towns being left to rot. After 1997, this all stops. This is Barking Central by the architects AHMM. And I think encapsulates what basically called Blairite modernism. That it is kind of modernism of a sort. The kind of Pomo thing of baubles and classical references and jollity stops. And no one's really theorised why it stops and how it stops. Everyone just suddenly thought it stopped maybe because we all looked at parallels and suddenly one day realised they were horrible. It's complicated. So on the face of it, all this has stopped in this. You have density all over again. Rather than spreading out across the landscape, you build to very, very high densities. You have flats once again. You have an architecture without ornament or historical reference once again, unless that historical reference is to Bruno Tower or Lake Corsica. So You also have very, very, very bright colours. That's very, very important. So if you don't have very, very bright colours, people might think it's a council estate, and that's bad. You have to try very, very hard to make it not look like previous kinds of modern architecture, because they are indelibly associated with working class housing. And these are aspirational developments, so you can't do that. But the differences are very, very interesting because they completely abandon things like the Parker Morris standards, named after two government ministers that came up with them. A sort of set standard instituted in the early 60s of the minimum amount of space you could have in a flat. At the time, very criticised as being too mean. But all flats would have to be double aspect, would have to have a certain amount of space, etc., etc., etc. They were abolished in the 80s. So these new aspirational blocks of flats that are not council estates are actually worse than council estates. They have far smaller flats, which are usually single aspects, which usually have much smaller rooms, etc., etc. Usually have much smaller communal spaces, usually much more kind of hemmed in, usually don't have orientation towards the sun or anything like that. But they do have bright colours, and they do have generally much cleaner communal areas. So they're cleaner at the moment. But going back to the kind of thing about common sense and how architectural common sense is a constant state of shifting, I want to go back to the 80s for a moment. And it must be fun to kind of ask, if anyone can guess where any of these three places are. But it would be a slightly futile game. They all basically look like they're in Essex. They're all under the influence of a document published in Essex in the 1970s called the Essex Design Guide. And Essex, this is famously sort of working class Tory area just outside East London, came up with a kind of series of guidelines based on defensible space. Based on making sure that new estates were designed so that crime would be at least discouraged in them. Ideas partly from Jane Jacobs about eyes on the street, but also partly from the much more paranoid ideas of Oscar Newman, which basically involved a militarised, barrack-like method of planning, whereby you can control all exits in and out and so forth. And you kind of obsessively use things like cul-de-sacs and so on. And the Essex Design Guide also recommended you use the local vernacular. The thing is that the rest of the country also used Essex's vernacular. So what we have here is Redcar in North Yorkshire, Liverpool, and Belfast. All basically using more or less exactly the same form of Essex, for completely different reasons. This is Redcar is a speculative estate built by Wimpey or Barrow Homes or one of them. A kind of typical form of sort of very, very cheap sort of development. With developments like this, you have again this kind of question of sort of semiotics sort of take over architecture. That all the kind of things that bring something like this into being are all completely non-architectural. That you've got to have certain things. You've got to have a driveway, you've got to have a front and back garden, and if at all possible, you've got to be semi-detached or detached. Now, given that there's usually very small plots for this sort of thing, you've got to somehow design an estate. Oh, and you've also got to have, all these kind of turning circles so that cars can sort of, get around and so on without being blocked out. You've also got to have this sort of security conscious planning, so that you can't walk into your estate without being spotted by you when you're twitching your curtains, etc., etc. So there's the sense that all these things are going into the planning ideas. And it's kind of like you kind of feed it into a machine and this is what comes out. Always reminds me of the Russian artist Klemar and Melamed did this series called America's Most Wanted, where they kind of polled people to find out what the order was in the painting and gave them it all at once. This is a painting that had every single one of them, happening at once, like sort of red Indian next to a mermaid and a sylvan, glaze and so forth, with a bit of abstraction on the corner. So it's sort of, this is this kind of accidental form. And in Liverpool, again, the kind of ostensible reasons are very, very different. In Liverpool, they demolished huge swathes of 1960s tower blocks and 1930s tenements. Mainly, I think, because they'd fallen into great dilapidation, but also because there was this kind of groundswell that what people want is houses with gardens. And Liverpool Council at this point was controlled by Militant, which was a Trotskyist organisation, which had managed to take over the local Labour Party. So this is being built by the very far left here. And it's much the same thing. What you have here in Liverpool, which you wouldn't get anywhere else, is this little park here, and that's the socialist bit. But the rest of it is exactly the same scale as we developed the Barratt homes or anyone else would have done. And you even get these perimeter walls here. You'll see in the top left-hand corner there, this long perimeter wall. These are kind of, again, part of this sort of security-conscious urbanism, where you've got to make sure you know who's coming in and out, who can't just walk into the estate, and so on. Of course, that was done en masse in Belfast. And in Belfast, it was done, not to stop people burgling houses, not in order to, make people in Redcoat feel more secure, but basically in order to make riots more easy to control. So there's a strange sense that everyone takes this as common sense. It's taken as common sense by the British government in Northern Ireland, in its direct rule of it. It's taken as common sense by completely capitalist developers. It's taken as common sense by very, very left-wing councils. And somehow, just 10 years later, by everyone, it's common sense that that's a bad thing. And it's completely common sense that said you should do something else. And I've often tried to work out where to date this shift. And I think the place to date this shift is a kind of the gradual lobbying efforts of Lord Richard Rogers from the late 80s and early 90s. And in the mid-80s, under the Greater London Council, another very left-wing local authority, which was eventually closed down under Margaret Thatcher, making London the only capital city in the world to have its own government. And it eventually got a sort of government, I'll get back to that later. The GLC ended up with this kind of big swathe of post-industrial land. And there was a fight between the GLC and developers. Developers wanted to build a kind of mixed-use area of luxury flats, luxury offices, cafes, art galleries, and so on, and hired Richard Rogers to design it. The GLC wanted suburban family homes on the site. This is a site which incidentally is tenable from the House of Parliament. And the GLC eventually won. And yet, strangely, by 1992, Richard Rogers is advocating the exact same things, except without them being run by property developers, in a co-written book with the Labour shadow culture minister. So somehow, and I'm not totally sure how, architects and thinkers like Rogers managed to convince the opposition party that what needs to happen is a moving away from this commonsensical sort of Southern California via Essex style towards sort of European modernism. Richard Rogers could build things like that all the time in Europe and was commissioned to do it very, very regularly. Certainly was commissioned to do it in the UK. And I think the first of those schemes to be built, just before Labour come into power, is Brindley Place in Birmingham. And Brindley Place is quite prophetic of this form, which later gets built everywhere, really. It moves away from small-scale suburbia. It moves away from an urbanism where the most important thing is where you can park your car, and actually makes an urbanism where the most important thing is the actual experience of walking around it. And it also moves away from the kind of obsessive traditionalism that has been commonsensical to this kind of mild, tamed modernism favoured by architects like Allies and Morrison and Rogers himself. And there are kind of, it's also on former industrial land always. And it's next to a canal. Birmingham famously has more canals than Venice. And so it's always by a river. There's this strange thing where regeneration always happens by rivers. I don't know why. The end result is this, unfortunately. The end result of this, let's go back to Europe, let's go back to modernism, let's go back to urbanism, is this. Is something, if anything, worse than the 1960s at its worst. Worse than the 1980s, it's worse even sometimes. This is, what's it called? I think this is an estate called the Pinnacles in Sheffield. And it's a development of student housing. And students are very much the vanguard of this, for reasons I'll get to in a second. And first of all, you should notice the things that make this completely different from a 1960s modernist council estate. First of all, what they've done here is they've built up almost every single part of the plot that they possibly can. There's no, there's no barrier to the noise coming from this dual carriageway, no barrier to the noise coming from this tram bridge. There's no, you just build right up to it. Of extraordinarily small flats. And you kind of hide all this with having lots and lots of asymmetrical cladding materials, and hiding the fact that you're basically building this extraordinarily poor quality. For some reason, this stuff has often been aimed at students, and I think this hits to why lots of the stuff is accepted as about that so awful. It's because it's transients. In the same way that someone working at a call centre doesn't join a trade union because they think, I'm only going to be here for 6 months. People here accept the fact that they've been given box rooms and charged massive rates for it because they think I'm only going to be here for 9 months. But there's a kind of sense that that this stuff is is considered completely temporary. This one is again interesting because it's at the point where it becomes less about ideology, more about control. That this is the headquarters of the Great London Authority, a sort of basically toothless body brought into being to replace the GLC. And this is a developer's site developed by Norman Foster on a private site where you can't picket, you can't strike, you can't sell a big issue, you can't do anything naughty because the whole thing's owned by developers. And the Great London Authority and the Mayor of London rent their building from this site. So this is one, you want to ask why this managed to happen. Here's your answer: the fact that what local government there is there on sufferance of the developers, not the other way around. You also get this kind of return to shopping centres in in this kind of new modernism. That there was that it was recognised that one of the real problems of 1980s disurbanism and its destruction of cities was the fact that you built out-of-town shopping centres and the inner cities dispersed out into them. People shopped there and high streets became ghost towns. So the basic idea was let's do it in central cities instead. A huge site in the town where I grew up, which used to be a Pirelli cables factory, was completely flattened to create like the second biggest shopping mall in the country at that point, in the 16th largest city. So overscaled. This one I'm including because it's architecturally interesting. This is a John Lewis, part of a very big shopping mall scheme in Leicester by Foreign Office Architects, the kind of big famous ex-Koolhaas firm. And essentially you can see this is exactly the same big box that you would usually have got on the edge of the motorway. But in order to kind of have it in the centre of the city and make it not alienating or not unpleasant, the architect becomes decorator in a way that they haven't really been since the 19th century. That they cease to kind of be sort of manipulators of space as modernists like to think themselves. And also cease to be evokers of historical ornament like the 1980s postmodernists were. And so they become people who are essentially given an envelope, given a big box, and asked to dress it up in a sort of jaggedy, geometric-y, deconstructive-y way. Another major element of this was culture preferably by waterways. This is a view from the New Art Gallery in Warsaw, in the West Midlands. It's a view from, which is cheating a bit because it's actually a very good building. But it's, the reason I'm showing the view from is to show that what happens is first you build a gallery. This brings the middle classes into the area, makes them hang around a bit, makes the area more safe for them. And then you get shopping development, block of luxury flats, loft conversion there somewhere, and regeneration whole when the recession hits. So the culture was sort of used as a Trojan horse through this period. It's a way of changing the image of places in order to make them safer for speculation. As interestingly was industry, or post-industry. This is the Templeton Carpet Factory in Glasgow. We generally try to keep Scotland out of this because of its differences, but in this it was certainly the same as everywhere else. In a country without an industrial policy, a country which essentially was kind of gradually selling off and getting rid of what little industry it had, even though throughout this period industry was making more money than the final speculation in the City of London, that they essentially would sort of sell off industrial buildings for property speculation, for the kind of land speculation that brought us to the current crisis. So you got some quite nice buildings got redeveloped, and that's very good. It's good that it was not demolished. And if it had remained a carpet factory, I'm quite sure there would have just been a big white shed there instead. But nonetheless, there's still something kind of worryingly idle about it, that the kind of skilled, unionised jobs that these places had were not replaced, and so they were kind of replaced with sort of selling them off to be secretly now empty flats. This is especially extreme in a scheme called Pathfinder, which was kind of labyrinthine. I could have done a whole talk really on that. It's a program for what's called housing market renewal, which basically means going to areas that didn't have a housing market and giving them one. And how do you give a place that has no housing market a housing market? You demolish loads of housing. You create demand, you create a shortage. And they did this en masse. This one is interesting in Salford because it's the only one where they actually kept the building and cleared it. So they cleared the site of its residents, originally planned to demolish it and build new speculative flats on the site, and then decided, hang on, we could probably do something else with this. Gave it to hip property developers Splash, who kept the facade, stripped everything else out. These are actually steel framed flats with a facade on top, that used to be terraced houses, and marketed them to the local workers at the Media City, the BBC was building next door, under the slogan, "Own your own Coronation Street house." Anyway, so this kind of moment, this moment of kind of trying to return to modernism, trying to return to Europe, and trying to return to urbanism, is cancelled, basically, ended, is kaput. One of the ways of sort of making clear it was kaput under the new government, the kind of conservative, liberal, or as I prefer to think of, Tory Whig coalition that has been running the country in a particularly extreme form of Thatcherism for the last 2 years. The first thing they did was cancel a school building program. And to justify it, they immediately said that it was a way of just making money for architects anyway. Which of course it wasn't, it was a way of making money for contractors, people like Serco and Capitalism and so on. And in order to justify this, the schools minister, Mike Gove, said, "We will not get Richard Rogers to design your school," because that would be terrible. And immediately commissioned the people behind the building of Dixon's and Tesco's superstores to advise on the design of the schools. So the whole thing is going full circle. New planning reforms mean that there'll be more suburbia. Lifting new enterprise zones mean there'll be more ex-urban business parks and retail parks. And, the kind of the cancellation schemes like this means that the new social programs are ending. The NHS reforms mean no new hospitals, but private ones. There's a kind of attack on council housing to kind of get rid of what little kind of poor people living in the city. So there's this kind of the whole thing going full circle all over again. When doing this, the kind of architectural style, if they can actually be kind of pinned down on these sorts of things, people in the coalition often advocate is a form of localism, or rather a form of vernacular. The Housing Minister Grant Shapps has frequently said that what he wanted was things like Welwyn Garden City in Letchworth, that this was his ideal for the new Britain that he wanted to build. And I suspect it will have much the same result in that, again, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, north of England and south of England will all again try and look like Essex. So, on like a desperate attempt to be at least slightly optimistic at the end of this, I want to talk about this. This is the occupied former Bank of Ireland building in Belfast. And one thing that happens in a recession is lots and lots of empty buildings. And you can already see people start to sniff around these. I was looking through actually a magazine I picked up today, like a sort of free magazine on Dublin design, and had a whole feature on pop-ups and people using disused buildings. And I don't know how this is working in Dublin, but certainly in London, basically this sort of means that you get artists or architects to do something whimsical with a space and also kind of keep it from being to keep it from having something useful done with it until until the whole property boom goes up all over again. Which is why squatting is a very, very interesting thing, but it's particularly politicised squatting. And in Ireland and the Republic and in Northern Ireland, there are of course huge swathes of buildings which are owned by NAMA, the bad bank, that is now holding various toxic assets. And similarly, or not quite so explicitly, in the UK there are huge amounts of derelict buildings now, which from kind of recent yuppie flats to old factories to whatever, to terraces that were gutted during Pathfinder. Usually which are more or less state-owned, or at least which are owned by companies which are basically state-owned but propped up by the state. So there's this whole infrastructure in place, given that private capital is basically at the mercy of government, so obviously can keep them alive. But there's all these sites, frequently, at least in the UK, inner city sites, prominent places, which could be reimagined for completely different purposes from the kind of endless old corruption that has termed the design of cities in the UK for the last 200 years. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions for us?
I'll start you on. You walked around Dublin a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, with some students of the Masters in Urban Design here and others. And you were very polite while we walked around. We spent 2 hours walking around. I don't think you'd been there before me here, you hadn't walked around. And then about 2 months passed, and there was an extraordinarily vitriolic and vicious and honest article in The Guardian, which I think
Wasn't The Guardian, it was my blog.
well, what was it? Well, you sure didn't get out to be on The Observer or The Guardian?
Not the one in Dublin.
Okay, let's say it was public.
It was on